She said it because she was desperate. Desperate to pretend there was still some power left in her hands, some choice that belonged only to her, even if that choice was reckless and absurd. "I will marry the first man who enters," Frances said, her voice bright enough to pass as wit, careless enough to hide the terror clawing beneath her ribs. The women around her laughed nervously. Someone whispered that she was brave. Someone else called her mad. No one took her seriously. Not really. Then the iron gates at the far end of the garden groaned open. The laughter died slowly, like a candle starved of air. A man stepped through, tall, still, dressed in dark formal clothing that made him look less like a guest and more like judgment itself. He did not smile, he did not hesitate, he did not look amused or confused or charmed. He looked straight at her. Frances felt the world collapse to the narrow space between them, to the sound of her own breath catching in her throat, to the impossible reality walking toward her with slow, deliberate purpose. Lloyd J. Berkeley, the Duke of Blackthorn, had arrived. Lady Hartwell's garden was full of silk and sunlight. Roses climbed stone walls in soft shades of pink and cream. Teacups clinked. Gentlemen spoke in clusters. Women laughed behind gloved hands. The afternoon air was warm and golden, as if the world itself wanted to be kind. But Frances B. Balch felt none of it. She stood near the refreshment table, her fingers tight around an untouched glass of lemonade, her heart thudding once, hard, then again. 5 seasons, 5 years of polite smiles and careful dances and watching younger women marry while she remained. And now her father's deadline, 6 weeks to accept the merchant's offer or be cut off entirely. The man walking toward her was unmistakable. Everyone knew him, the Duke of Blackthorn, cold, powerful, unmarried by choice, a man whispered about in drawing rooms like a ghost story. A man who avoided society, who was never seen to laugh, who turned down every desperate mother's matchmaking schemes with nothing more than a single, icy glance. And now he was crossing the lawn with slow, measured steps, his grey eyes fixed on her like winter water, calm, steady, and impossibly cold. Beside Frances, her friend Amelia leaned closer, her voice a panicked whisper. "Oh God, Frances, you did not summon him." "I was joking. I was absolutely joking." The Duke stopped a few feet away from her. Up close he was even more imposing, his face sharp and unreadable, his posture perfect, his presence filling the space like gravity itself had shifted toward him. The garden seemed to hold its breath. "Miss Frances B. Balch," he said. Her name sounded different in his voice, deliberate, final. He did not ask, he stated it. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely steady. "You heard you," he said, his tone flat and without inflection. Her stomach dropped. "I heard your declaration," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "and I accept." The words struck her like cold water thrown over her face. "You accept," she repeated faintly. "Yes." "That was a joke." "I am not laughing." Someone nearby gasped. Amelia made a small strangled sound. Frances felt heat rush to her cheeks, then drain away just as fast, leaving her cold and shaking. "Your Grace," she said carefully, fighting to keep her voice from breaking, "surely you understand that I was speaking out of frustration. I did not mean—" "You interrupted," he said, his voice calm, precise, unmoved. "You are unmarried, you are under pressure, and you are being honest without meaning to be." He tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were a problem to solve. "That does not make your words any less true." Frances opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came. He held out his arm. "Walk with me," he said. "We are being observed." She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to laugh this off, to run before it consumed her entirely. But she had already been consumed, hadn't she? 5 seasons, no offers, no future, only warnings and ultimatums, and a merchant whose hands lingered too long and whose smile made her skin crawl. The Duke's arm was solid beneath hers. The garden erupted in whispers behind them, and as they walked toward the quiet corner near the stone wall of roses, Frances realized with terrible clarity that her joke, her desperate, careless joke, had just shattered her life into before and after, and she had no idea which side would destroy her. They walked in silence until they reached the stone wall covered in pale roses. Somewhere beyond the hedge, voices murmured and laughed, but the sounds felt distant, muffled. Lloyd stopped and turned to face her. "You regret it already," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Frances admitted, her voice tight. "Is that what you wanted to hear?" "It is acceptable," he replied. She stared at him, searching his face for something, amusement, cruelty, satisfaction, but found nothing. "Why me?" she asked. He studied her as if she were a puzzle rather than a person. "Because you do not want me," he said. Frances blinked. "That is your reason." "It is the most important one." She let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "I assure you, Your Grace, there are many women who do not want you." "Most of them want my title," he replied calmly. "You want escape." The word struck its mark. Frances felt her breath catch. She looked away, toward the roses. "You were desperate," Lloyd continued, his tone even, factual. "So am I." Her pulse quickened. "Desperate for what?" "A wife." "That hardly narrows it." "I need an heir," he said, "and a marriage without illusions, no romance, no expectations of affection." Frances folded her arms. "You make it sound like a business contract." "It is." "And what do I gain from this arrangement?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Protection, independence, a title that ensures no man may touch you without consequence." Her breath caught despite herself. "And love," she said quietly, "you offer none of that." "I offer honesty, which is more than most." Frances thought of her father's ultimatum. 6 weeks to accept the merchant or be cut off. She thought of the merchant's hands, his smile that made her skin crawl. Then she thought of the man before her, cold, blunt, but honest. "How soon would you expect an answer?" "Tomorrow," he said. "If I am to call on your father, I must do so before gossip turns against you." "You planned this." "I responded to opportunity." "You cornered me." "I gave you an option." They stared at each other. The air between them felt tight, charged. "If I agree," Frances said slowly, "I will not be silent. I will not be owned. I will not pretend to be grateful." His lips twitched, just barely. "I would be disappointed if you did." "And if I refuse?" "Then nothing changes," he said, "except that you will still be trapped." The truth of it made her chest ache. Frances closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them. "Call on my father tomorrow," she said. Lloyd inclined his head. "Wise." Frances laughed softly. "Or foolish. Those are often the same thing." He offered his arm. "Shall we return before society invents its own ending?" Frances took it, her hand trembling. As they walked back into the garden, Frances knew one thing with terrible clarity. Her life had just split into before and aft. Frances barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Duke's face, calm and unreadable. Her own thoughts ran wild, sharp and restless. By morning, the entire household was awake early. Servants hurried through hallways. Her mother paced the drawing room. Her father read the newspaper without seeing a word. Word had spread faster than fire. By breakfast, everyone seemed to know the Duke had spoken to Frances in private. Some claimed he proposed on the spot. Others said she had fainted in his arms. Frances sat at the table, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at her untouched food. "Frances," her mother said with forced calm, "you must tell us exactly what happened yesterday." Her father lowered his newspaper. "And you must speak clearly." Frances's throat tightened. "The Duke asked to walk with me." "We saw that," her father replied. "What did he say?" "He wishes to call on you today." Her mother's hand flew to her chest. Her father's expression froze. The room fell silent. "For what purpose?" her father asked, although his voice already held the answer. "A marriage proposal," Frances said. The words settled heavily over the table. Her mother blinked, stunned. "To you?" Frances nodded. "But why?" her father demanded. "You barely know one another." "He said he does not need to know me." Her father pushed back his chair, pacing. "This makes no sense. A duke does not choose a bride in such a reckless manner." Frances swallowed hard. "I said something foolish, something he overheard." Her mother, alarmed. "What did you say?" Frances felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I joked that I would marry the first man who walked into the garden." Her father stopped pacing. His face turned dark. "And he took that seriously?" "Yes." Her father's voice became cold. "That was reckless, childish." She looked down. "I know." Her mother touched her arm. "Frances, you cannot marry the Duke. No respectable man would propose under such strange circumstances." Frances looked at the tablecloth, her voice soft. "He is very serious." Her father scoffed. "He must have some hidden motive." "He already has power," Frances said quietly. Her father began pacing. "Then perhaps he seeks control." Her stomach twisted. The Duke wanted honesty, not power, a wife who expected nothing. Her mother leaned closer. "Frances, my dear, do you want this marriage?" Frances hesitated. Her heart whispered no. Her choices whispered escape. "I want freedom," Frances said softly, "and he offers that." Her father stopped pacing. "Freedom? You believe a duke will give you freedom?" "No," Frances said, "but he might give me safety." Her father grew still. "From whom?" Frances met his eyes. "You know who." Her mother looked away. Her father's jaw tightened. A knock struck the front door. 3 loud, deliberate knocks. Her mother gasped. Her father straightened. Frances felt her heart jump. Servants moved through the hall. The door opened. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackthorn," the butler announced. Frances stood as the Duke entered the dining room. He looked exactly as before, composed, dark, impossible to read. Her mother curtsied. Her father bowed stiffly. "Miss Balch," the Duke said, "Your Grace." He looked at her father. "May we speak privately?" Her father led them to the small sitting room. Frances followed, her mother's worried eyes tracking her until the door closed. Inside, sunlight spilled through tall windows. The Duke stood near a low table. Her father sat, but did not invite the Duke to do the same. "You wish to speak about Frances?" "Yes, I wish to marry her." Her father folded his hands. "Your Grace, is this not hasty?" "No." "You barely know her." "I know her character, her honesty." Frances felt her cheeks warm. Her father frowned. "What assurances can you give her?" The Duke turned toward Frances, his eyes steady. "I will not mistreat her. I will not confine her. She may manage her own affairs, keep her own friendships. She will not be pressured. She will have control over her household. She will be safe." Frances's breath caught. Her father leaned forward. "And what do you expect?" "Loyalty, truth, nothing more." "Do you care for her, Your Grace?" The Duke paused. "Care is not the right word, but I find her presence steady." Her father said, "And if I refuse you?" The Duke's voice turned cool. "Then society will wonder why. Rumors will form." Frances's father stiffened. "Is that a threat?" "No," the Duke said. "It is the world we live in." Francis stepped forward. "Father, may I speak?" Both men turned. "Your Grace," she said, "yesterday you said you needed a wife without illusions, someone who would not expect affection." "Yes." "Then you offer honesty rather than romance." "I do." Francis lifted her chin. "Then I will offer the same. I do not know if I can trust you, but I know what awaits me if I stay here. I cannot return to that." The Duke watched her steadily. "Then you accept?" Her father looked horrified. "Francis!" "Yes, I accept." A brief softness crossed the Duke's face, gone in an instant. Her father exhaled. "The bans must be read." "No bans," the Duke said. "I request a special license." "So soon?" Francis asked. "Yes. If we delay, pressure upon you will grow." Her father looked between them. "This is madness." "It is decided." The Duke bowed to her father. "I will return tomorrow with the license." He turned to Francis. "You will need to prepare." "I know," she said, her voice wavering. He paused. "If anything troubles you before the wedding, send word. I will come." Her breath hitched. "Thank you." "Do not fear what you cannot yet see, Miss Balch." Then he was gone. Her father sank into a chair. Her mother entered moments later. Francis stood motionless, heart beating fast. She was no longer trapped. She was walking into something unknown, something that might break her or save her. The special license arrived in her father's study like a death warrant wrapped in silk. Francis stood in the doorway, watching her father's hands shake as he held the Archbishop's seal up to the afternoon light. Lloyd sat across from him, perfectly still, his dark coat absorbing the shadows of the room. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd been summoned downstairs. 3 days, her father said, his voice hollow. You expect me to prepare my daughter for marriage in 3 days? I expect nothing from you, Mr. Balch. Lloyd's tone was flat, final. The preparations are mine to make. Francis need only appear at the chapel. Her mother had wept earlier, clutching Francis's hands and asking what madness had possessed her. But Francis had no answer that wouldn't sound like a confession. I was drowning. He offered me air. How could she explain that this cold arrangement felt safer than any warmth her parents had ever provided? The settlement, her father tried again, desperation creeping into his bluster. We haven't discussed. There is no settlement. Lloyd rose, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Your daughter comes to me with nothing but what she chooses to bring. In return, I will ensure she wants for nothing. That is the extent of our business. Francis felt the words settle over her like snow. Nothing but what she chooses to bring, not her dowry, not her father's debts, or her mother's pearls, or the merchant's promised gold, just herself, and whatever she decided had value. Lloyd finally turned to her. His eyes were gray as winter stone, and just as unyielding. Do you have any objections, Miss Balch? She should. Any sensible woman would. This was madness, a marriage built on a joke and finalized with bureaucratic efficiency. There would be no courtship, no tender declarations, no promises of devotion, just a special license, a quiet chapel, and a man who made it perfectly clear he expected nothing from her heart. But standing there, watching her father's face redden with impotent fury, Francis felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest. Freedom. No, she said, and her voice didn't shake. No objections. Lloyd's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes, approval, perhaps, or recognition. He gave her father a curt nod. Then we are finished here. He moved toward the door, and Francis found herself following, pulled by some invisible thread she couldn't name. Behind them, her father sputtered protests that fell like dead leaves, meaningless, already forgotten. In the hallway, Lloyd paused. 3 days, Miss Balch. I'll send a carriage for you at 10. She nodded, throat tight. He left without another word, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Francis stood alone in the dim passage, staring at the open door he'd walked through. There was no turning back now. The madness had been finalized, signed and sealed. In 3 days, she would step through that open door and into a life she couldn't yet imagine. And for the first time in 5 seasons, Francis B. Balch felt something other than dread. She felt ready. The chapel was empty, except for the vicar and 2 witnesses Lloyd had procured from somewhere Francis didn't ask about. She stood in the vestibule, her hands pulled inside her gloves, wearing a dress the color of cream that her mother had insisted was appropriate for a hasty wedding. Through the narrow doorway she could see Lloyd waiting at the altar, his back straight as iron, his profile carved from shadow and stone. 3 days had passed like a fever dream. Now here she was, about to marry a man she'd spoken to perhaps a dozen times, whose first name she'd only learned yesterday when the vicar asked for it on the license. Lloyd James Barclay. Even his name felt formal, distant. The vicar nodded to her. It was time. Francis walked down the aisle alone. Her father had refused to come, citing the scandal. Her mother had wept into her handkerchief and claimed a headache. Francis told herself she preferred it this way. No performance, no pretense, just the truth of what this was. Lloyd turned as she approached. His gray eyes met hers, and for a moment something almost like concern flickered across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar, unreadable calm. "Miss Balch," he said quietly. "Your Grace," she replied, and took her place beside him. The vicar began. The words washed over her like water, ancient, formal, utterly disconnected from the strange reality of this moment. Francis heard herself respond at the appropriate times, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Then came the vows. Lloyd's voice was low, deliberate. "I vow to protect your freedom within the bounds of this union. You will want for nothing. You will fear no one. What is mine is yours to command as you see fit." It wasn't the traditional vow. The vicar's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. Francis drew a breath. She had thought about this, lying awake in her childhood bed for the last time. What could she promise a man who wanted nothing from her heart? "I vow loyalty," she said, and her voice rang clearer than she expected. "I will honor this arrangement with honesty. I will ask nothing of your heart that you cannot give." Lloyd's expression shifted, barely, but she saw it. Something in his eyes softened just for a heartbeat. "The ring," the vicar prompted. Lloyd produced a band of gold, simple and unadorned. He slid it onto her finger with steady hands, and Francis felt the cool metal settle against her skin, like a brand, a boundary, a key. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words fell like stones into still water. Lloyd looked at her for a long moment. Then, with careful formality, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles. Not a kiss, a seal, an acknowledgement. "Lady Blackthorne," he said. The name felt foreign in her ears. She wasn't Francis Balch anymore. That girl, desperate, cornered, afraid, had been left behind in her father's house. "Shall we?" Lloyd offered his arm. Francis took it, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the fine fabric. Together they walked back down the aisle, past the empty pews, through the chapel doors, and out into the pale morning light. A carriage waited, black lacquer, Blackthorne's crest on the door. Lloyd handed her in with the same careful distance he'd maintained throughout. As the carriage rolled forward, Francis looked back once at the small chapel growing smaller behind them. No turning back now. She was married, bound by vows that promised protection, not passion, freedom, not love. And somehow, that felt like the most honest thing she'd ever done. The manor rose from the mist like something out of a ghost story. Frances pressed her face closer to the carriage window, watching as Blackthorn materialized through the grey afternoon, all dark stone and towering chimneys, windows like closed eyes. It was massive, austere, and utterly silent. No servants lined the drive to welcome them, no banners flew, just the crunch of gravel beneath wheels and the low whisper of wind through ancient oaks. Lloyd sat across from her, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the window. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the chapel. The carriage stopped. A single footman appeared to open the door, his livery immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. Lloyd descended first, then turned to offer Frances his hand. She took it and stepped down into her new life. The entrance hall swallowed her whole. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow. A grand staircase curved upward like a spine. Everything was dark wood and stone, beautiful in a cold, forbidding way, like a cathedral built for silence rather than prayer. "It's not much for warmth," Lloyd said quietly behind her. "I'm aware." Frances turned to find him watching her with that unreadable expression. "It's grand," she said carefully. "It's a tomb." His bluntness startled her. "My father preferred it this way, dark, quiet, controlled." He paused, then gestured toward the hall. "But it's yours now as much as mine. You have the power to change anything you wish." She blinked. "Anything?" "Open the curtains, bring in light, redecorate every room if it pleases you." Something shifted in his voice, not quite warmth, but perhaps permission. "I have no attachment to how things were, only to how things will be." A woman appeared from a side corridor, older, stern-faced, dressed in black. "Mrs. Halloway, my housekeeper. She'll show you the manor and answer any questions." Mrs. Halloway curtsied, her sharp eyes taking Frances's measure in a single sweep. "The staff knows you are mistress here. What you say is law. If anyone gives you difficulty, inform me immediately." Frances felt dizzy. Hours ago she'd been her father's property, a problem to be solved. Now she stood in a manner that felt like a fortress, being told she had power over all of it. "Where," she began, then steadied herself. "Where will you be?" "My study. I have correspondence to attend to." He inclined his head slightly. "Mrs. Halloway will bring you to the drawing-room when you're settled. We'll dine at 8. He turned to leave, then paused. "Lady Blackthorn." She looked up. "Welcome home." The words were formal, distant, but they landed somewhere deep in her chest nonetheless. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing up the stairs and fading into the vast silence of the manor. Mrs. Halloway cleared her throat. "Shall we begin the tour, my lady?" Frances pulled her shawl tighter, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, the weight of this enormous, shadowed house, the weight of a future she couldn't yet fathom. "Yes," she said, "let's begin." Lloyd found her in the library just before dinner. Frances had wandered there after Mrs. Halloway's exhaustive tour, drawn by the promise of books and the need for something familiar in this strange, cavernous place. She stood before the tall windows, watching darkness settle over the grounds like a held breath. "You've found the one room I actually use," Lloyd said from the doorway. She turned. He'd changed from his wedding clothes into something simpler, dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar. It was the most informal she'd seen him, and somehow it made him seem more real, less like a figure from a cautionary tale. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. The library was warmer than the rest of the house, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, a fire crackling in the hearth. Lloyd moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of wine. He offered her one, and she took it, their fingers not quite touching. "We should talk, establish the parameters of this arrangement." Frances's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "All right." He gestured to the chairs by the fire, and they sat, not close but not distant either. Lloyd stared into his glass for a long moment before speaking.
I want you to understand something about me, Lady Blackthorne. His voice was measured, careful. I have no experience with love, not the kind poets write about or young women dream of. My father was a cold man who raised me to value duty above all else. My mother died when I was young. He paused. I don't know if I'm capable of what you might hope for in a husband. Frances felt something crack open in her chest, not disappointment, but recognition. I'm not asking you to love me. His eyes lifted to hers, startled. I made a vow today, she continued quietly. I promised not to demand what you cannot give. I meant it. Lloyd studied her face as if searching for deception. Finding none, he exhaled slowly. Then let me be clear about what I can offer. Honesty, protection, respect for your autonomy within these walls. He set his glass down. I will not control you as your father did. I will not demand affection or pretense, but I will expect loyalty and discretion. You'll have both. And in return, he continued, you may live as you choose. Pursue your interests. The painting studio Mrs. Halloway showed you, it's yours. The library, the gardens, the funds to do with as you wish. This partnership need not be a prison. Frances swirled the wine in her glass, watching firelight dance through the liquid. What about other aspects of marriage? A muscle tightened in Lloyd's jaw. I require an heir eventually, but there is no urgency. When, if that time comes, it will be discussed openly between us. I will not impose myself upon you. The bluntness should have shocked her. Instead, Frances felt relief flood through her veins. No games, no pretense, just the brutal honesty of two people who'd made a bargain and intended to honor it. It feels very strange, she admitted. It is strange. For the first time, something almost like humor touched his voice. Perhaps honest strangeness is better than comfortable lies. Frances met his gray eyes across the firelight. Perhaps it is. Lloyd raised his glass slightly. To an honest partnership, then. She lifted hers in return. To honesty. The crystal chimed softly as they touched glasses, sealing their strange accord in wine and firelight and words that felt more binding than any wedding vow.
Frances woke to sunlight. It startled her, actual warm sunlight streaming through windows she hadn't realized faced east. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory settled. Blackthorne. Her wedding night spent alone in a vast bedroom, with Lloyd somewhere in another wing entirely, honoring his promise of distance. She dressed quickly, refusing the lady's maid Mrs. Halloway had assigned her, and ventured downstairs. The house felt different in daylight, still grand, still imposing, but less like a mausoleum. Dust motes danced in shafts of light. Somewhere she heard the distant clatter of kitchen work. She found Lloyd in the breakfast room, reading correspondence over coffee. "Good morning," he said, rising briefly. Always formal, always correct. "Good morning." Frances helped herself to tea from the sideboard, acutely aware of how strange this domesticity felt. Married, sharing breakfast, strangers. Lloyd set down his letter. "I have something to show you when you're finished." Curiosity prickled. "I'm finished now." He led her through corridors she hadn't seen on yesterday's tour, up a different staircase to the eastern wing of the manor. They stopped before a set of double doors. "The gallery," said Lloyd. "It hasn't been used in years. My mother painted before—" He didn't finish. "I thought it might suit your needs." He opened the doors. Frances stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The room was flooded with light, tall windows along two walls, northern exposure perfect for painting. Someone had cleaned it recently. She could smell lemon oil and beeswax. Dust sheets had been removed from furniture she could now see clearly. Easels, a workbench, cabinets that likely held supplies. But it was the center of the room that made her throat tighten. A new easel stood there, clearly expensive, beside a table laden with supplies. Paints, more colors than she'd ever owned. Brushes of every size, their bristles pristine. Canvas, both stretched and raw. Charcoal, pastels, everything an artist could want.
"I took the liberty," Lloyd said quietly behind her. "Mrs. Halloway mentioned you'd asked about painting during the tour yesterday. I had these brought from London." She turned to him, stunned. "When? We only arrived yesterday afternoon." "I sent word 3 days ago, after the special license." He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with her attention. "You mentioned painting once, in the garden, before—" I remembered. She had mentioned it, barely, in passing, when he'd asked what she did to occupy herself through the endless social seasons. A single comment she hadn't thought he'd heard, let alone remembered. She struggled for words. "This is extraordinary." "It's practical," corrected Lloyd, but his voice held something softer. "You'll need occupation. I'm often engaged with estate business. I thought—" He paused, then met her eyes. "I thought you should have something that's entirely yours." Francis looked around the gallery again, at the light, the space, the carefully chosen supplies. This wasn't the gesture of a cold man. This was attentiveness dressed in practicality, kindness disguised as logic. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. Lloyd inclined his head. "I'll leave you to explore. If you need anything else, inform Mrs. Halloway." He left to go. "Lloyd." She stopped, and she saw his shoulders tense at the use of his first name. "This is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." For a long moment he stood silent in the doorway, his back to her. Then, without turning, "You deserve kindness, Francis. I'm merely correcting an oversight." He left before she could respond. Francis stood alone in her gallery, surrounded by light and color and possibility, feeling the first real warmth bloom in her chest since she'd made that reckless vow in Lady Hartwell's garden. Perhaps this strange marriage might be more than mere survival, after all.
Dinner that evening felt like a test neither of them had studied for. Frances descended the stairs at precisely 8 o'clock, wearing a simple green silk dress that had been among her few personal belongings. The dining room waited below, another cavernous space, but someone had lit every candle. The long table that could seat 20 had been set for 2, plates positioned at one end, close enough for conversation but not intimacy. Lloyd stood when she entered, and she noticed he'd made an effort too. His coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat precisely tied. They were both trying, she realized, both attempting to play at being married without any idea what that actually meant for people like them. "You look well," he said. "Thank you, so do you." The formality felt absurd, but neither of them seemed capable of anything else. He pulled out her chair, and she sat. Servants appeared with the first course, soup that smelled of herbs and cream. They ate in silence for several moments, the clink of silver against china unnaturally loud. "I spent the afternoon in the gallery," Frances offered finally. Lloyd looked up, and— She hesitated, then added, "I started sketching, the view of the grounds from the windows." Something flickered in his expression, interest perhaps, or approval. "I'd like to see it, when you're ready to show anyone." "You would?" "Why not? It's your work." Such a simple statement, but it struck her deeply. Her father had called painting a frivolous waste. Her mother had merely tolerated it as a slightly more respectable hobby than reading novels. But Lloyd spoke of it as work, as something worthy of attention. "I'll show you, when it's finished." They fell into easier conversation after that, small things, careful things. Lloyd asked about her preferences for the household. Frances asked about the estate. Neither of them spoke of anything too personal, but the ice between them began to crack, just slightly. When the final course was cleared, Lloyd stood and offered his hand. "A walk. The gardens have a night-blooming jasmine. It's quite remarkable in moonlight." Frances took his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm through her glove. They walked through the French doors onto the terrace, into air that smelled of earth and flowers and the approaching night. The jasmine was as beautiful as he'd promised, pale blooms glowing like small moons, their fragrance almost overwhelming. They walked slowly along the gravel path, not touching except for her hand on his arm, proper and distant.
"This is strange," Francis said softly. "Yes, but not terrible." Lloyd glanced at her, and in the moonlight his features seemed less severe. "No, not terrible." They walked in silence for a while longer. Francis felt something unfurl in her chest, delicate, tentative, barely there. Not love, not even affection, really, but something softer than fear, something that felt dangerously like hope. She had a gallery filled with light, a husband who kept his promises, a home where she could breathe without permission. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd once imagined as a girl. There would be no passionate declarations, no grand romance, but standing in the garden with Lloyd beside her, the jasmine blooming in the dark, Francis felt the trembling edge of something she'd never had before, a life she could finally call her own. "Thank you," she said quietly. Lloyd looked at her questioningly. "For the open door," she clarified, "for letting me walk through it." His hand covered hers briefly where it rested on his arm, a single moment of contact, deliberate and warm. "We walked through together," he said, and somehow that felt like the most honest promise of all.